Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Snowglobe Secret. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for tonight's winter mystery. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Do you remember your first Christmas snow globe? Was it a gift from someone special, a treasure discovered in an antique shop, or perhaps an heirloom passed down through generations? Share your memories in the comments below. I always love hearing about the objects that hold our winter memories. Now, settle in with your hot cocoa or mulled wine, and let me tell you the story of Miss Jane Marple and the secret hidden within the snow. Chapter 1. A Collection Beneath Glass. The bell above Harrington's Antique Emporium chimed with crystalline clarity as Miss Jane Marple pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping from the bitter cold of Christmas Eve into the warm, musty embrace of accumulated history. The shop on St. Mary Mead's High Street had always possessed a particular atmosphere that distinguished it from the more pedestrian establishments surrounding it, a quality that suggested mysteries lurking among the carefully arranged curiosities. Miss Marple adjusted her wool coat and surveyed the interior with the practiced eye of someone who understood that the most interesting stories often resided in the smallest details. The shop was more crowded than usual, filled with last-minute shoppers seeking that perfect Christmas gift. Yet she noticed how they all seemed to gravitate toward one particular display that dominated the rear wall of the establishment. Marcus Harrington himself stood beside this remarkable collection, his thin frame impeccably dressed in a waistcoat of burgundy velvet that had seen better decades, attending to each customer with the particular mixture of deference and superiority that only antiquarians of long standing could properly achieve. His collection of Christmas snow globes occupied custom-built shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, each sphere positioned on its own velvet cushion and illuminated by tiny spotlights that made the contents sparkle with almost supernatural brilliance. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington," Miss Marple said pleasantly as she approached the display, her keen eyes already cataloguing the extraordinary variety before her. "I understand you have quite the reputation for vintage snow globes. I'm hoping to find something special for my great niece." Harrington's pale eyes lit with the particular enthusiasm of a collector sharing his passion. "Ah, Miss Marple, how delightful to see someone who appreciates genuine quality. These aren't mere tourist trinkets, I assure you. Each piece in my collection has been authenticated, documented, and priced according to its true historical value." Miss Marple examined the nearest globe, a Victorian piece depicting a miniature cathedral surrounded by swirling silver particles that caught the light like trapped stars. The price tag made her raise her eyebrows slightly. £500 seemed rather excessive for what appeared to be, despite its obvious age and craftsmanship, essentially a decorative bauble. "The prices reflect their rarity," Harrington explained, noting her reaction with apparent satisfaction. "That particular piece dates from 1847, commissioned for the Great Exhibition. The liquid inside has never been replaced, and the silver flakes are actually microscopic engravings of biblical verses, one of only 3 known to exist." "How fascinating," Miss Marple murmured, though something about the globe troubled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The liquid seemed unusually cloudy for something that had supposedly remained sealed for over a century, and there was a peculiar weight to it that seemed inconsistent with its apparent construction. She moved along the display, noting how each globe bore a detailed card describing its provenance, date of manufacture, and particular significance. A globe from 1933 depicted Buckingham Palace and was allegedly from the personal collection of a minor royal. Another from 1945 showed St. Paul's Cathedral standing defiant amid stylized bombing damage, marketed as a tribute to London's resilience during the Blitz. "You seem to specialize in pieces with local connections," Miss Marple observed, recognizing several scenes from the surrounding countryside captured in miniature within the glass spheres. Harrington nodded enthusiastically. "I've made it my life's work to preserve these fragments of our local heritage. Many of these pieces come from estate sales, family collections that are being broken up. It's rather sad, really, how modern generations fail to appreciate the treasures their ancestors accumulated." Miss Marple noticed a ledger open on the counter nearby, its pages filled with meticulous entries in Harrington's distinctive handwriting. Each transaction was recorded with extraordinary detail, including not just the sale price and date, but also the buyer's name, address, and curious notations about their collecting interests and financial circumstances. "You maintain very thorough records," she commented. "Essential in this business," Harrington replied, closing the ledger with a swift motion that suggested he hadn't intended for it to be observed. One must know one's clientele to serve them properly. "Now then, might I suggest this charming piece from 1952? Local church scene, quite affordable at merely £200. Miss Marple accepted the globe he offered, surprised again by its unexpected weight. The scene within depicted St. Mary Mead's own church, rendered in exquisite detail, surrounded by what appeared to be falling snow, but which, upon closer inspection, seemed to contain unusual variations in colour and texture among the white particles. "I'll consider it," she said diplomatically, though her mind was already turning over the various curiosities she had observed. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington, how does one determine the authenticity of these pieces? Surely there must be quite a market in reproductions." Harrington's expression tightened slightly, though his professional smile remained intact. "Authentication requires years of experience, Miss Marple. The weight of the glass, the composition of the liquid, the materials used in the scene itself, all these factors contribute to verification. I've been studying these pieces for 30 years. I can spot a fake from across the room." "How reassuring," Miss Marple replied, though she noticed how his fingers drummed nervously against the counter as he spoke. She made her excuses and departed, promising to return after Christmas to make her purchase, though in truth she had no intention of spending such exorbitant sums on what seemed to her to be rather ordinary curiosities, dressed up with elaborate stories. As she walked home through the falling snow, she found herself unable to dismiss the nagging sensation that something about Harrington's collection was profoundly wrong, though she couldn't quite identify what had triggered her unease. Chapter 2. Shattered Mysteries at Dawn. The church bells of St. Mary Mead had barely finished their Christmas morning peal when the village's peaceful holiday atmosphere was shattered by young Timothy Baker's terrified screams. The boy, who supplemented his pocket money by delivering newspapers regardless of season or holiday, had discovered something terrible through the frost-covered windows of Harrington's antique emporium. Miss Marple, enjoying her traditional Christmas breakfast of kedgeree and toast, heard the commotion from her dining room and immediately set aside her napkin with the resigned air of someone who recognized that duty called at the most inconvenient moments. She wrapped herself in her warmest coat and made her way toward the high street, where a crowd was already gathering despite the early hour and bitter cold. Dr. Haydock's car was parked at an awkward angle outside the shop, suggesting he had arrived in considerable haste. Through the windows, Miss Marple could see him kneeling beside something on the floor, his medical bag open beside him. Inspector Slack's police vehicle arrived moments later, the inspector himself emerging with an expression that suggested his Christmas had been thoroughly ruined. "Everyone back, please," Slack commanded, with his characteristic blend of authority and irritation. "This is a crime scene. No one enters without my express permission." Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe without appearing to be improperly curious, a skill she had perfected over many years of discreet investigation. Through the shop window she could see an extraordinary scene of destruction. Where yesterday evening had stood Harrington's magnificent collection of snowglobes, there was now nothing but devastation. Hundreds of glass fragments littered the floor, creating a treacherous carpet of glittering shards. The carefully constructed miniature worlds lay scattered among the debris, tiny churches and castles, crushed beneath what appeared to have been deliberate, systematic destruction. Among this crystalline battlefield lay Marcus Harrington himself, his burgundy waistcoat now darkened with blood, his hands and arms bearing dozens of deep lacerations. Even from her position outside, Miss Marple could see that his injuries were extensive, and that Dr. Haydock's efforts were purely procedural, rather than therapeutic. Constable Perkins emerged from the shop, his young face pale with shock. He conferred briefly with Inspector Slack before addressing the growing crowd. "The shop will remain closed while we investigate. Anyone who had business with Mr. Harrington should report to the police station this afternoon." Miss Marple caught Dr. Haydock's eye as he emerged from the shop, and he approached her with the weary expression of someone who had seen too much death to be surprised by its variations. "Messy business, Jane," he said quietly. "Appears someone struck him with one of those heavy crystal globes, then went about destroying the entire collection. The lacerations on his hands and arms suggest he tried to protect himself as the destruction continued around him." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured, though her sharp eyes had noticed something the doctor apparently had not. Among the debris visible through the window, she could see strange glints of colour that seemed inconsistent with mere glass and water. There were flashes of gold, silver, and what appeared to be precious stones among the scattered fragments. "When do you estimate it happened?" she inquired. Dr. Haydock consulted his notes. "Based on the body temperature and rigour, I'd say between midnight and 2 this morning. The cold in the shop has affected my calculations somewhat, but certainly several hours ago." Inspector Slack approached them with his notebook at the ready, his expression suggesting he was already formulating theories about the crime. "Robbery gone wrong, most likely," he announced with characteristic certainty. "Someone knew about his valuable collection, broke in to steal it, and killed him when he tried to interfere." Miss Marple observed mildly that it seemed odd for a thief to destroy the very items they had come to steal, but Slack dismissed this with an impatient gesture. "Panic, Miss Marple. The thief was surprised by Harrington, killed him in the struggle, then destroyed the evidence in panic. Yet the destruction seems rather methodical for panic," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Every single globe appears to have been deliberately broken, and that would have taken considerable time and created substantial noise." Before Slack could respond, Sergeant Lake emerged from the shop carrying an evidence bag that caught the morning sunlight in a most unusual way. "Inspector," he called urgently, "you need to see what we're finding in the debris." The contents of the bag were extraordinary. Among the glass shards and miniature figurines were several pieces of obviously valuable jewellery. A diamond ring glinted among the fragments, along with what appeared to be a pearl necklace and several gold bracelets. Each piece was wrapped in what looked like waterproof silk, the kind used by jewellers for long-term storage. "Good heavens," Dr. Haydock exclaimed. "Where did those come from?" "Inside the globe, sir," Sergeant Lake replied, his voice reflecting his own amazement. The jewellery was hidden in the water reservoirs. When the globes were intact, the wrapped pieces looked like decorative glitter or snow. We're finding more with each globe we examine. The implications of this discovery transformed the entire nature of the investigation. This was no simple robbery gone wrong, but something far more complex and sinister. Harrington's Snowglobe collection had been an elaborate facade, concealing what appeared to be a massive hoard of stolen jewellery. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the unusual weight she had noticed in the globes she had handled, the cloudy liquid that had seemed inconsistent with their supposed age, and Harrington's nervous reaction to her interest in his authentication methods. The pieces of an elaborate puzzle were beginning to present themselves, though the complete picture remained frustratingly obscure. Inspector Slack was already barking orders to his subordinates, demanding a complete inventory of the recovered jewellery and cross-reference with reported thefts. "Check every burglary report from the past 50 years, he commanded. "I want to know where every piece came from." As the police set about their systematic investigation, Miss Marple noticed a figure watching from across the street. An elderly woman in a shabby coat stood perfectly still despite the cold, her face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction that seemed entirely inappropriate to the tragic circumstances. Miss Marple recognised her as Dorothy Thornby, widow of the late Constable Edward Thornby, who had served St. Mary Mead faithfully until his death in 1954. Mrs. Thornby met Miss Marple's gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked away with the measured pace of someone who had waited a very long time to witness a particular conclusion. Miss Marple filed this observation away with all the others, sensing that Mrs. Thornby's presence was no coincidence. Chapter 3. 20 Years of Christmas Crimes. The afternoon of Christmas Day found Miss Marple in the village library, which she had persuaded young Mrs. Pemberton to open specially for police purposes. Inspector Slack had commandeered the reading room as a temporary incident room, and the long oak tables were now covered with evidence bags, photographs, and decades of police reports that had been retrieved from dusty storage. Miss Marple had offered her assistance in cataloguing the recovered jewellery, a task Slack had accepted with his usual grudging acknowledgement that her attention to detail could prove useful. As she carefully documented each piece, she found her mind returning to a series of events from the past that had never quite made sense until now. "These burglaries," she said to Sergeant Lake, who was organising the police reports chronologically. "I remember them quite well. They caused considerable distress in the village for many years." Lake looked up from his paperwork with interest. "You recall the actual crimes, Miss Marple? That would have been 20 to 40 years ago." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and settled into one of the library's comfortable chairs, her mind casting back through the decades. "Indeed, Sergeant. The first one I recall was at the Weatherby estate in December 1933. Lady Weatherby's diamond necklace vanished during their annual Christmas ball. The family was hosting over 200 guests, and the theft wasn't discovered until the following morning." Lake shuffled through his papers and produced a yellowed report. "Here it is, December 23rd, 1933. Diamond necklace valued at £3,000 never recovered. Constable Edward Thornby investigating." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Poor Constable Thornby. He was quite devoted to solving these crimes. "I remember him interviewing everyone who had attended the party, checking alibis, examining every possible entry point. He was convinced the thief was someone with intimate knowledge of the house. The pattern that emerged from the reports was remarkably consistent. Every theft had occurred during the Christmas season, always targeting wealthy homes during large gatherings when security would be compromised by the presence of numerous guests. The stolen items were invariably small but valuable pieces of jewellery that could be easily concealed and transported." "Look at this," Sergeant Lake said suddenly, pointing to a notation in one of Thornby's reports. He suspected someone was using the Christmas parties to case the houses, someone who would have legitimate access without raising suspicion. Miss Marple examined the report carefully. Constable Thornby had compiled a list of individuals who had attended multiple parties where thefts occurred. Among the names, one stood out with startling clarity. Marcus Harrington, proprietor of Harrington's Antique Emporium, had been present at nearly every gathering, having cultivated relationships with wealthy families by offering to purchase their heirloom Christmas decorations. He opened his shop in 1934, Miss Marple observed, consulting her own memories. Just months after the first theft. He specialised in Christmas collectibles from the very beginning, which gave him perfect reasons to visit these homes during the holiday season. Inspector Slack entered the library with his characteristic brisk energy, though his expression showed the strain of working on Christmas Day. "We've identified 16 pieces so far," he announced, "all reported stolen between 1933 and 1953. The Weatherby diamonds, Mrs. Ashford's pearl set, the Carmichael emeralds, the list goes on. All stolen during Christmas gatherings," Miss Marple added quietly, "and all from homes where Marcus Harrington had been a guest or had business dealings regarding Christmas decorations." Slack's eyebrows rose sharply. "Harrington was connected to all of them?" "It appears so, Inspector. He would arrive weeks before Christmas, ostensibly to evaluate collections or deliver purchases, which gave him opportunity to study the layout of the houses, observe security measures, and identify valuable items. Then, during the chaos of Christmas entertaining, he would return as a guest and commit his thefts. But how did he conceal the stolen goods?" Slack demanded. Thornby searched everywhere, including Harrington's shop on multiple occasions. He never found anything. Miss Marple gestured toward the evidence bags containing the broken snow globes. "Because the stolen items were hidden in plain sight, Inspector. Who would think to look inside decorative snow globes for stolen jewellery? The globes could be opened, the jewellery inserted wrapped in waterproof silk, then carefully resealed. The items would be invisible among the artificial snow, and the globes themselves were considered valuable antiques above suspicion. The audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. For 20 years, Harrington had displayed his stolen goods openly in his shop, hidden within what appeared to be innocent Christmas decorations. Customers had admired and even purchased these globes, never suspecting they were handling stolen property. The theft stopped in 1953, Sergeant Lake observed, checking his chronology. Why would Harrington stop if he'd been so successful? Miss Marple remembered that year with particular clarity. That was when Constable Thornby became suspicious of Harrington specifically. He had noticed the pattern of Harrington's presence at the crime scenes and began investigating him more closely. The poor man became quite obsessed with proving Harrington's guilt. Inspector Slack consulted another report. Thornby died in February 1954. Heart attack, according to this. Says the stress of the unsolved cases contributed to his death. Miss Marple recalled the funeral, the way the village had mourned their dedicated constable, while simultaneously whispering about his failure to solve the Christmas burglaries. His widow, Dorothy, had been devastated not just by his death, but by the shadow it cast over his years of faithful service. "Mrs. Dorothy Thornby," she said suddenly. "Inspector, has anyone spoken with her? She was seen entering Harrington's shop yesterday afternoon, the day before his death." Slack made a note with obvious interest. Dorothy Thornby? She must be quite elderly now. 78 years old, Miss Marple supplied from memory. She lives in that small cottage on Church Lane, maintains herself by taking in sewing and knitting. Her granddaughter Lucy visits regularly to help with shopping and household tasks. The connection between the widow of the frustrated constable and the murdered proprietor of the antique shop was too significant to be coincidental. Whatever had brought Dorothy Thornby to Harrington's shop on Christmas Eve, it had preceded his death by mere hours. "We'll need to interview her immediately," Slack decided. "Lake, finish cataloguing this evidence. I want a complete list of what was hidden in those globes. Miss Marple, would you accompany me?" Mrs. Thornby might be more comfortable with another elderly lady present. As they prepared to leave the library, Miss Marple noticed something among Constable Thornby's reports that made her pause. His final entry, dated December 30th, 1953, contained a cryptic notation. "The Snowglobes check water?" The question mark suggested uncertainty, a theory not quite formed, a suspicion that death had prevented him from pursuing. Chapter 4. The Widow's Christmas Eve Visit. The cottage on Church Lane seemed to huddle against the cold, its modest proportions and weathered exterior, speaking eloquently of genteel poverty maintained with stubborn dignity. Miss Marple had visited Dorothy Thornby several times over the years for parish charity matters, and she knew the widow took fierce pride in maintaining her independence despite reduced circumstances. Inspector Slack knocked firmly on the painted door, which was decorated with a simple holly wreath that showed signs of careful yearly reuse. After a long moment, footsteps could be heard approaching, and the door opened to reveal Dorothy Thornby herself, dressed in a black wool dress that had been skillfully mended multiple times. Mrs. Thornby's face, lined with years of disappointment and struggle, showed no surprise at finding police on her doorstep on Christmas Day. Indeed, there was something in her expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit, had perhaps been waiting for it since hearing of Harrington's death. "Inspector Slack," Mrs. Thornby said calmly, her voice steady despite her age. "And Miss Marple. I suppose you'd better come in. I've just put the kettle on." The cottage's interior was scrupulously clean but sparsely furnished, each piece showing its age but maintained with meticulous care. On the mantelpiece sat a photograph of Constable Edward Thornby in his uniform, young and proud, taken before the years of frustration had worn him down. They settled in the small sitting room, where a modest fire provided barely adequate warmth. Mrs. Thornby poured tea with hands that showed only the slightest tremor, whether from age or emotion was impossible to determine. Beside her chair sat a large knitting basket, its contents partially visible beneath a current project. "Mrs. Thornby," Inspector Slack began formally, "we need to ask you about your visit to Harrington's Antique Emporium yesterday afternoon. Several witnesses saw you entering the shop around 4 o'clock. Dorothy Thornby sipped her tea before responding, her faded blue eyes meeting the inspector's gaze directly. "Yes, I visited Mr. Harrington yesterday. I had business with him that had waited 30 years to be conducted." "What sort of business?" Slack pressed. Before Mrs. Thornby could respond, the front door opened and a young woman's voice called out cheerfully, "Gran, I've brought your Christmas dinner from the church. They had extras and—" "Oh." The voice trailed off as Lucy Thornby entered the sitting room and saw the visitors. Lucy was perhaps 25, with her grandmother's determined chin and her grandfather's earnest eyes. She clutched a covered dish and stared at Inspector Slack with obvious alarm. "It's all right, Lucy dear," Mrs. Thornby said gently. "The inspector is here about Mr. Harrington. We're just having tea." Lucy set down the dish with trembling hands. "Gran, you don't have to say anything without a solicitor present. I've been reading about rights and—" "Hush, child," Mrs. Thornby interrupted firmly. "I have nothing to hide from the law. Your grandfather would be ashamed if I didn't cooperate with a police investigation." Miss Marple observed the interaction between grandmother and granddaughter with interest, noting Lucy's protective stance and the way her eyes kept darting to the knitting basket beside her grandmother's chair. "Mrs. Thornby," Miss Marple said gently, "we've discovered that Mr. Harrington's snowglobes contained stolen jewellery from burglaries that occurred between 1933 and 1953. Your late husband investigated those crimes." Dorothy's expression didn't change, but her grip on her teacup tightened slightly. Edward knew. He knew Harrington was the thief, but he could never prove it. It destroyed him, knowing that man was walking free while Edward was branded a failure. "How did Constable Thornby come to suspect Harrington?" Inspector Slack inquired, his notebook at the ready. Mrs. Thornby set down her teacup and moved to a small writing desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she produced a worn leather notebook that Miss Marple recognised as a police constable's official journal. "This was Edward's," she said, handling it with obvious reverence. He kept detailed notes on every case, especially the Christmas burglaries. She opened the notebook to pages marked with recent pencil notations. Here, December 1953. Edward had finally noticed the pattern. Harrington was always present at the homes before the thefts, always had reasons to study the layout, always attended the Christmas gatherings where the crimes occurred. The notebook revealed Constable Thornby's meticulous investigation, his growing certainty of Harrington's guilt, and his frustration at being unable to find evidence. The final entry, which Miss Marple had seen in the police files, was expanded here with additional notes. "The Snowglobes check water," Edward had written. H's collection grew after each theft. New globes appearing within weeks of crimes. Connection? How to examine without warrant? "He died 6 weeks later," Mrs. Thornby said bitterly. "The doctor said it was his heart, but I knew better. It was the shame of being thought incompetent, the frustration of knowing the truth but being unable to prove it. Harrington killed him as surely as if he'd used a weapon." Lucy moved to comfort her grandmother, but Dorothy straightened in her chair with remarkable dignity. "For 30 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my husband died in disgrace while his tormentor prospered. Every Christmas, I watched Harrington's business thrive, watched him socializing with the very families he'd robbed, knowing what he'd done to Edward." "What changed?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "What made you visit him yesterday?" Dorothy glanced at Lucy before answering. "My granddaughter has been helping me research things at the library. Modern techniques, she calls it. Looking up information about antique restoration, including how snow globes are constructed and repaired." Lucy looked miserable but defiant. "I found articles about opening and resealing vintage snow globes. It's actually not that difficult if you have the right tools and materials." That's when we realised how Harrington might have hidden the jewellery. "So you confronted him," Inspector Slack stated, rather than asked. Dorothy nodded slowly. "I took Edward's notebook with me. I wanted Harrington to know that Edward had been right all along. I wanted him to admit what he'd done, to clear my husband's name even if it was 30 years too late." "And did he admit it?" Slack pressed. Dorothy's expression hardened. He laughed. He actually laughed at me. Said Edward had been a fool who couldn't see what was right in front of him. Said the village had gotten the policeman it deserved, one too stupid to solve crimes that a child could have unravelled. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the inadequate fire. Miss Marple could feel the weight of 3 decades of bitterness and frustration filling the small space. Whatever had happened in Harrington's shop, it had been precipitated by years of accumulated grief and injustice. "Mrs. Thornby," Inspector Slack said formally, "I need to know exactly what occurred during your visit to the shop." Dorothy met his gaze steadily. I showed him the notebook. I told him I knew about the jewellery and the snow globes. I said I would go to the police with my suspicions unless he confessed. "And then," Slack prompted. "And then I left," Dorothy replied simply. He was alive when I walked out of that shop, furious, threatening to sue me for slander, but very much alive. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Knitting Basket. Inspector Slack's expression suggested considerable scepticism, as he regarded Dorothy Thornby's calm assertion of innocence. But before he could press further, Miss Marple gently interjected with a request that seemed entirely unrelated to the matter at hand. "Mrs. Thornby," she said pleasantly, "I couldn't help but admire your knitting. Is that the pine cone pattern? I've always found it particularly challenging." Dorothy looked momentarily, confused by the change of subject, but a lifetime of proper manners compelled her to respond. "Why, yes, Miss Marple. It's a pattern my mother taught me. Would you like to see?" As Dorothy reached for her knitting basket, Lucy made an involuntary movement as though to stop her, then caught herself and stood frozen with obvious anxiety. Dorothy lifted out the partially completed shawl, revealing the basket's contents beneath. Various skeins of wool, knitting needles of different sizes, and tucked along one side, her late husband's notebook, which she had supposedly taken to Harrington's shop the previous day. Miss Marple's keen eyes also noticed something else. A small glass vial had rolled to the bottom of the basket, partially hidden beneath a ball of burgundy wool. The vial appeared to contain clear liquid and bore a handwritten label that was partially obscured, but seemed to include the word glycerin. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, examining the shawl with apparent fascination while actually studying the basket's contents. "Mrs. Thornby, this wool is an unusual shade. Did you dye it yourself?" Dorothy's hands stilled on the knitting needles. "I sometimes do my own dyeing, yes. It's more economical than buying specialty colours." Inspector Slack, following Miss Marple's lead, leaned forward to examine the basket more closely. "Mrs. Thornby, is that the notebook you claimed to have taken to Harrington's shop yesterday?" Dorothy's composure finally cracked slightly. Yes, I must have brought it back with me, despite telling us you left it with Harrington." Slack's voice had taken on the sharp edge of a detective who had caught someone in a lie. "Mrs. Thornby, I'm going to need the complete truth about what happened in that shop." Lucy suddenly burst into tears. "It's my fault," she exclaimed. "All of it is my fault. I'm the one who researched the Snowglobes. I'm the one who convinced Gran that we could prove what Harrington had done." "Lucy, no," Dorothy said sharply, but her granddaughter continued through her tears. "We went together," Lucy confessed. "Gran didn't want me involved, but I insisted. I said she needed a witness if Harrington admitted anything. We brought supplies with us, glycerin, tools, even a camera, in case we needed to document evidence." Miss Marple gently touched Lucy's hand. "Tell us exactly what happened, dear. The truth is always better than allowing speculation to flourish." Lucy wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. We arrived at the shop around 4 o'clock. Mr. Harrington was alone, preparing to close early for Christmas Eve. Gran showed him the notebook, told him we knew about the jewellery hidden in the Snowglobes. "What was his reaction?" Inspector Slack asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "At first he denied everything," Lucy continued. "Said we were delusional, threatened to call the police himself. But then Gran mentioned the specific pattern, how the new globes always appeared after the thefts, how the dates matched perfectly with grandfather's notes. Dorothy took up the narrative, her voice steady but weighted with emotion. That's when his demeanour changed entirely. He stopped denying and started gloating. He told us everything, how he'd fooled Edward for years, how easy it had been to rob those pompous families while they were busy with their Christmas parties. He was proud of it," Lucy added bitterly. "Proud of destroying my grandfather's reputation, proud of getting away with it for so long." Miss Marple noticed that both women were carefully avoiding the crucial point. "And then what happened?" she prompted gently. Dorothy and Lucy exchanged glances before Dorothy continued. "I wanted to break one of the globes, just one, to prove what was inside. I thought if we could show the police actual evidence, they'd investigate properly. Harrington tried to stop me, grabbed my wrist quite roughly." Lucy's voice rose with remembered anger. "He hurt her, this elderly woman, and he twisted her arm hard enough to leave bruises. I tried to pull him away, and he pushed me into the display case. The globes started falling, Dorothy said quietly. Several broke on the floor and we could see the jewellery inside glittering among the glass and water. Harrington went absolutely mad. He started screaming that we'd destroyed his life's work, that he'd make sure we were arrested for vandalism and assault. Inspector Slack looked up sharply. Are you saying the globes were already breaking before Harrington was killed? Some were, Lucy admitted. Maybe a dozen had fallen when I crashed into the display. But then, she trailed off, unable to continue. Then what? Slack pressed. Dorothy straightened in her chair, her aged face set with determination. Then I picked up one of the larger globes, a heavy crystal piece from the Victorian era, and I defended my granddaughter. Harrington was advancing on Lucy with his fists raised, and I did what any grandmother would do. You struck him, Slack stated. Once, Dorothy confirmed, just once, but he fell backward into the main display. The entire collection came crashing down. Hundreds of globes shattered, and Harrington... He tried to get up, but there was glass everywhere. His hands, his arms, he cut himself terribly trying to stand. And you left him there? Slack's voice carried official condemnation. We tried to help, Lucy protested, but there was so much blood and glass everywhere. Gran wanted to call for help, but I... She stopped, fresh tears flowing. You were afraid, Miss Marple said kindly. You realised how the situation would appear, an elderly woman and her granddaughter attacking a respected shopkeeper. Dorothy reached for her granddaughter's hand. We panicked. I'm not proud of it, but we ran. We hoped someone would find him and get help. We never imagined he would die. The confession hung in the air, creating a moment of profound silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Lucy's quiet sobs. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an expression of professional resignation mixed with something that might have been sympathy. Mrs. Dorothy Thornby, he began formally, but Miss Marple gently interrupted. Inspector, might I make an observation? The evidence will show that Mr. Harrington died from a combination of the head injury and blood loss from the lacerations. Given his age and the circumstances, it's entirely possible he would have survived if he'd received prompt medical attention. What's your point, Miss Marple? Slack asked, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly well. My point is that this was clearly a case of self-defense that tragically escalated due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Mrs. Thornby was protecting her granddaughter from assault, and their failure to immediately report the incident, while regrettable, was motivated by fear rather than malice. Chapter 6. Traces of Old Investigations. The police station on Christmas evening presented an unusually subdued atmosphere, with only essential staff maintaining their posts, while Inspector Slack processed the formal statements from Dorothy and Lucy Thornby. Miss Marple had been permitted to remain as a courtesy, her insights having proven valuable enough to override normal procedure. While they waited for the formal proceedings to begin, Sergeant Lake brought in several evidence boxes from Harrington's shop, including the recovered jewellery and, significantly, what remained of the antique dealer's business records. These documents, retrieved from his office safe, painted a fascinating picture of a criminal enterprise hidden beneath legitimate commerce. Inspector, Lake announced, examining a leather-bound journal, you need to see this. It appears to be Harrington's private record of the stolen goods, which pieces were hidden in which globes, complete with dates and original owners. Slack took the journal and whistled softly as he reviewed its contents. The man documented everything. Here's the Weatherby diamonds, hidden in globe number 47, a supposed Austrian piece from 1889. The Ashford pearls in globe 12, disguised as a commemoration of Queen Victoria's Jubilee. Miss Marple studied the entries with professional interest. He was remarkably methodical, she observed. Each piece carefully catalogued, its hiding place noted, even the method of insertion documented. Look here, he notes, using heated tools to soften the seals, then a special compound to reseal them invisibly. It was then that young Police Constable Perkins entered carrying another box, this one containing items found in Harrington's workshop behind the main shop. Among the specialised tools and supplies was something that made Miss Marple's breath catch, a familiar leather notebook, water-stained and worn, but unmistakably another of Constable Thornby's official journals. That's Edward's, Dorothy said immediately, from where she sat with Lucy, both women having Been brought to the station for formal questioning. That's his notebook from 1953, the one that went missing after his death. I searched everywhere for it. Inspector Slack opened the notebook carefully, revealing pages of meticulous notes in Constable Thornby's distinctive handwriting. The entries detailed his investigation into Harrington with increasing certainty and frustration. The final entry, dated February 3rd, 1954, just 2 days before his death, was particularly revealing. He writes that he confronted Harrington directly, Slack read aloud, told him he knew about the snowglobes, threatened to get a warrant to examine them. Harrington laughed at him, said no magistrate would issue a warrant based on such ridiculous suspicions. Dorothy's face had gone pale. Edward never told me he'd confronted Harrington. He came home that night so defeated, so broken. He said he'd failed, that he'd never be able to prove anything. 2 days later, her voice broke. 2 days later, he had his heart attack. Miss Marple finished gently. Mrs. Thornby, did your husband have any history of heart problems? None whatsoever, Dorothy replied firmly. He was healthy as a horse, everyone said so. The doctor was puzzled, said it must have been the stress of the unsolved cases. But Edward had dealt with stress his entire career. Sergeant Lake had been examining more items from the workshop and suddenly held up a small brown bottle. Inspector, this is interesting. It's labelled as a cleaning solution, but the chemical formula written beneath. That's not for cleaning antiques. Let me see that, Slack demanded, taking the bottle and studying the label. He turned to Miss Marple with a grim expression. You were a nurse during the war, weren't you? What do you make of this formula? Miss Marple examined the notation carefully. This appears to be a combination of substances that, when mixed, could produce symptoms very similar to a heart attack. Rapid heartbeat, chest pain, difficulty breathing, and in sufficient doses, death. It would be virtually undetectable in a standard post-mortem examination of that era. The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Lucy gripped her grandmother's hand tightly as the full horror of the revelation became clear. He murdered Edward, Dorothy whispered. Harrington didn't just destroy his reputation, he actually killed him. Inspector Slack was already calculating the implications. If Thornby confronted him on February 3rd and died on February 5th, Harrington had both motive and opportunity. The question is how he administered the substance. Miss Marple remembered something from the notebook. Constable Thornby mentions here that Harrington offered him tea during their confrontation, said it was a peace offering, a chance to discuss things civilly. If the substance was in the tea, it would have taken a day or two to fully take effect. Dorothy stood suddenly, her elderly frame trembling with rage. For 30 years I mourned, Edward thinking he died of shame and failure, when actually he was murdered by that monster, and Harrington lived free all that time, prospering from his crimes. Mrs. Thornby, Inspector Slack said formally, this information changes the nature of the case considerably. While you still struck Harrington, we now have evidence that he was himself a murderer who killed your husband to prevent his crimes from being exposed. Lucy spoke up with sudden urgency. Does this mean Gran acted in a kind of delayed self-defense? Harrington killed my grandfather, and when he threatened us in the shop, Gran was defending against the same man who had already destroyed our family once. That's for the courts to decide, Slack replied, though his tone had softened considerably. However, given these circumstances, I'm inclined to recommend that Mrs. Thornby be released on her own recognizance pending further investigation. Miss Marple had been studying another document from Harrington's records, a detailed timeline of his activities in early February 1954. Inspector, look at this. Harrington recorded destroying several globes on February 6th, the day after Constable Thornby's death. He notes here that they were compromised pieces that needed to be eliminated. He was destroying evidence, Lake concluded. Thornby must have been closer to the truth than anyone realized. His investigation had identified specific globes, and Harrington destroyed them to prevent anyone following up on Thornby's work. Dorothy sank back into her chair, tears flowing freely now. Edward was right all along. He was a good policeman, a dedicated officer who solved the crimes but was murdered before he could prove it. All these years of shame and disgrace, and he was the hero, not the failure. Miss Marple moved to comfort her, reflecting on the tragic irony of the situation. Constable Thornby had indeed solved the Christmas burglaries, had identified the criminal and the method, but had paid with his life for his diligence. His widow had spent 3 decades believing her husband a failure when he had actually been murdered for coming too close to the truth. The recovered notebook revealed more details of Thornby's investigation, including lists of specific globes he suspected contained stolen goods, detailed observations of Harrington's movements, and even sketches of how he believed the globes could be opened and resealed. It was a masterpiece of detective work that had been suppressed by murder and hidden for 30 years. Chapter 7. Lucy's Library Research. The morning after Christmas brought a pale winter sun that illuminated the police station's interview room, where Lucy Thornby sat with her grandmother, both women looking exhausted, but somehow lighter, as though a great burden had been partially lifted. Miss Marple had been permitted to attend the formal interview as a witness to the previous day's revelations, and Inspector Slack had adopted a notably less aggressive approach than his usual interrogation style. "Miss Thornby," Slack began, addressing Lucy formally, "I need you to explain exactly how you came to research the Snowglobe construction methods and what prompted this investigation." Lucy straightened in her chair, her young face showing determination despite the dark circles under her eyes. "It started 3 months ago," she said clearly. "I was helping Mrs. Pemberton reorganize the library's archive section when I found a box of newspaper clippings that had belonged to my grandfather." "These were Constable Thornby's clippings?" Slack asked, making notes. "Yes," Lucy confirmed. Gran had donated them years ago, thinking they might be of historical interest. They were all articles about the Christmas burglaries, meticulously organized by date. But what caught my attention was a modern notation someone had added, a reference number for a book about antique restoration. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "How curious. Do you recall which book?" Lucy nodded. "Victorian Decorative Arts, a Restoration Guide, published in 1952. Someone had bookmarked a chapter specifically about snow globes and similar sealed glass ornaments. The book detailed how they could be opened for repair without damaging the seal." "And you believe your grandfather had marked this passage?" Inspector Slack inquired. "The handwriting looked like his," Lucy replied. "The same careful script I'd seen in his notebooks. But here's the strange thing. The book was published in 1952, but the checkout card showed it had been borrowed by someone else entirely in December 1953, Mr. Marcus Harrington." A significant glance passed between Miss Marple and Inspector Slack. Harrington had researched the very methods that Constable Thornby was investigating. "I became obsessed," Lucy admitted. "I spent weeks in the library reading everything I could find about antique globes, their construction, their history. Mrs. Pemberton helped me access academic journals through interlibrary loans. That's when I discovered something remarkable." She paused to pull a folder from her bag, producing several photocopied pages covered with her neat annotations. "There's a very specific technique for creating sealed glass globes that was only used by certain manufacturers. The seal requires a particular compound that includes glycerin, resin, and several other chemicals. It becomes pliable when heated, but creates an almost invisible seal when cool. Precisely the method Harrington documented in his private journal," Slack observed. Lucy continued with growing confidence. "I also found records of antique dealers who had been caught hiding contraband in similar ways during the war. It's not a new technique, just an obscure one. Someone would need specialized knowledge to even think of it." Dorothy spoke up for the first time. "When Lucy showed me her research, I couldn't believe it at first. But then she demonstrated with an old globe from a charity shop, showed me how easily it could be done with the right tools and materials." "You actually practiced the technique?" Slack asked sharply. Lucy flushed but met his gaze steadily. "I had to be certain before we confronted Harrington. I bought several worthless globes from various shops and practiced opening and resealing them. It took me weeks to perfect it, but eventually I could do it leaving barely a trace." Miss Marple considered this information thoughtfully. "So you went to Harrington's shop armed with both knowledge and practical experience. You knew exactly what to look for." "More than that," Lucy said, producing another document. "I had discovered something else. The library had records of all purchases made for historical collections in the village. Harrington had bought specific books on jewellery valuation, gemology, and precious metals, all between 1933 and 1953. He was educating himself about exactly the items that were being stolen. Inspector Slack studied the documentation with evident interest. "This is thorough work, Miss Thornby. You've essentially completed the investigation your grandfather started." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to clear his name. Growing up, I heard the whispers about how he'd failed to solve the biggest crime spree in village history. Other children would tease me about having a useless copper for a grandfather. I knew he was better than that." Dorothy reached for her granddaughter's hand. "You did more than clear his name, dear. You proved he was murdered for being too good at his job." Miss Marple had been studying Lucy's research notes and noticed something significant. "Lucy, dear, this notation here about the chemical composition of the sealing compound. Did you share this information with anyone else?" Lucy thought carefully. "Only Mrs. Pemberton at the library. She was fascinated by the historical aspect and suggested I write an article for the local historical society journal. Oh, and Mr. Mitchell at the chemistry shop when I needed to understand what some of the compounds were." "When did you speak with Mr. Mitchell?" Slack asked quickly. "About a week ago," Lucy replied. "I needed to know if the materials were still available, what modern equivalents might be. He was very helpful, even offered to order some specialty items for my research." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. Mr. Mitchell's shop was next door to Harrington's Antique Emporium. Sound carried easily between the buildings, and Mitchell was known for his inability to keep interesting gossip to himself. "It's possible Harrington learned about your research," Miss Marple suggested gently. "If Mr. Mitchell mentioned your inquiries, Harrington would have realized someone was investigating his methods." Lucy paled. "You mean he might have been expecting us?" "It would explain his initial calm reaction," Slack noted. "He'd had time to prepare his denials, perhaps even hide some evidence. Though clearly, he didn't anticipate the confrontation becoming physical." Dorothy's expression hardened. "He wasn't expecting an old woman to fight back. He thought he could intimidate us the way he'd intimidated Edward 30 years ago." "But you proved him wrong," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Though I suspect the revelation about your husband's murder changed everything. That wasn't self-defense anymore. It was long-delayed justice." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with an air of finality. "Miss Thornby, your research has provided crucial evidence in solving not just the current case, but also decades of cold cases. The families who lost their valuables will be grateful to finally have answers, and your grandfather's reputation will be fully restored." Chapter 8. The Confrontation Reconstructed. Inspector Slack stood in the ruins of Harrington's shop, surrounded by the glittering debris of hundreds of shattered snow globes, as he attempted to reconstruct the exact sequence of events that had led to Marcus Harrington's death. Miss Marple accompanied him, along with Sergeant Lake and the police photographer, who was documenting every detail of the crime scene in daylight. "Based on the Thornby women's statements," Slack said, gesturing to the shop entrance, "they arrived at approximately 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The shop was still open, and Harrington was alone." Miss Marple studied the layout carefully. The door chime would have announced their arrival, and Harrington would have had a clear view of who was entering from his position behind the counter. If he had indeed learned about Lucy's research from Mr. Mitchell, he would have recognized the significance of their visit immediately. The display cases formed a horseshoe shape around the shop's interior, with the most valuable pieces, those containing the stolen jewellery, occupying the central position. The arrangement created a natural barrier between the entrance and Harrington's workspace, forcing visitors to navigate around the displays to reach him. According to their statements, Slack continued, the initial confrontation occurred here, near the main display. Mrs. Thornby presented the notebook and accused Harrington directly of the thefts. Miss Marple noticed something significant about the floor. Inspector observed the pattern of glass distribution. The majority of fragments are concentrated in this area, but there's a secondary cluster near the back wall. Sergeant Lake knelt to examine the evidence more closely. "You're right, Miss Marple. It's as though the destruction occurred in 2 distinct phases, which aligns with the Thornby statement," Slack noted. "The first globes fell when Lucy was pushed into the display, creating this initial scatter pattern. The fatal confrontation and subsequent massive destruction happened moments later." Miss Marple moved carefully through the scene, her experienced eye taking in details others might overlook. The blood evidence was particularly telling. There were droplets leading from the main impact site toward the shop's rear exit, suggesting Harrington had attempted to escape or seek help after his injury. He didn't die immediately, she observed. The pattern suggests he was conscious and mobile for several minutes after being struck. Dr. Haydock's report confirms that, Slack replied. The head injury was serious, but not instantly fatal. It was the combination of blood loss from the lacerations and the head trauma that proved lethal. If he'd received immediate medical attention, he might have survived, Miss Marple finished, which makes the Thornby women's decision to flee all the more tragic. They left believing they'd killed him, when in fact their absence sealed his fate. The photographer was documenting the recovered jewellery, which had been carefully catalogued and laid out on evidence tables. The sheer volume was staggering, representing decades of systematic theft from the village's wealthiest families. 20 years of crime, Sergeant Lake said wonderingly. All hidden in plain sight. How did no one ever suspect? Because Harrington was clever, Miss Marple replied. He cultivated an image of respectable antiquarian expertise. He was invited to the best homes trusted with family heirlooms. Who would suspect that the man evaluating your grandmother's Christmas decorations was actually planning to rob you? Inspector Slack had found Harrington's appointment book, which revealed the full extent of his activities. Look at this. He had appointments scheduled with 3 prominent families for January, all to evaluate their Christmas collections for possible purchase. Still planning future crimes, Lake observed. He never intended to stop. Miss Marple examined the appointment book more carefully. No, Sergeant. I believe these were legitimate appointments. Look at the dates. All in January, after the Christmas season. He was actually going to buy their decorations, not steal from them. Why would he change his pattern after all these years? Slack asked. Because Lucy's research had frightened him, Miss Marple suggested. He knew someone was investigating his methods. These appointments might have been his attempt to appear completely legitimate, to throw off suspicion if questioned. The revelation painted Harrington in an even more calculating light. He had been prepared to adapt his criminal enterprise in response to potential exposure, showing a level of cunning that had kept him free for decades. There's something else, Sergeant Lake announced, returning from the shop's back room. I found these in his office safe. He produced a stack of letters, all addressed to Harrington in various hands, dating back over many years. As Inspector Slack examined them, his expression grew increasingly grim. Blackmail, he announced. These are from people who had discovered or suspected his activities. He was extorting them to keep quiet. Miss Marple read one of the letters, her face reflecting deep sadness. This is from Mrs. Ashford, whose pearls were stolen in 1938. She writes that she recognized them in one of his globes but couldn't prove they were hers. He threatened to claim she was trying to steal from him if she went to the police. How many victims were there? Lake asked, appalled. The letters revealed at least a dozen people who had suspected Harrington but had been silenced through threats, blackmail, or simple intimidation. The antique dealer had created a web of fear that protected his criminal enterprise as effectively as any lock or safe. This explains why no one came forward, even when they suspected, Slack said heavily. He had something on everyone, knowledge of affairs, financial troubles, family secrets. He used his position in the community to gather intelligence, then weaponized it. Miss Marple noticed one letter in particular, dated just a week before Harrington's death. It was from someone signing themselves only as a friend, warning Harrington that questions were being asked about his collection. This might be from Mr. Mitchell, she suggested. Feeling guilty about revealing Lucy's research, perhaps trying to warn Harrington indirectly. The reconstruction was nearly complete. The physical evidence, combined with witness statements and documentary proof, painted a clear picture of the confrontation. Dorothy and Lucy Thornby had arrived seeking justice for Constable Thornby. Harrington had initially tried to brazen it out with denials and threats. When they persisted, showing knowledge of his methods, he had become violent. The first globes fell accidentally when Lucy was pushed. Dorothy had struck Harrington in defense of her granddaughter. Harrington had fallen into his own display, bringing down the entire collection and revealing decades of hidden crimes in a cascade of shattered glass and stolen jewellery. It's almost poetic justice, Sergeant Lake observed quietly. His criminal empire literally came crashing down around him. Chapter 9. Justice delayed, but not denied. The courtroom at the county assizes was packed on the unseasonably warm January morning when Dorothy Thornby's case came before the judge. The story of the Christmas Eve confrontation at Harrington's Antique Emporium had captured the public imagination, with newspapers dubbing it the Snowglobe murder, and painting Dorothy as both villain and victim in equal measure. Miss Marple sat in the public gallery, having been called as a witness for the defence. Around her she recognised many faces from St Mary Mead, including several members of families whose jewellery had been recovered from Harrington's collection. The atmosphere was one of subdued anticipation, rather than the hostile judgment that might have been expected. The prosecutor, Mr Gerald Fortescue, was a Queen's Counsel known for his methodical approach and reluctance to pursue cases where public sympathy clearly lay with the defendant. His opening statement was notably measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the facts of this case are not substantially in dispute. Mrs. Dorothy Thornby struck Mr. Marcus Harrington with a heavy glass globe, causing injuries that ultimately led to his death. However, the circumstances surrounding this action require careful consideration. The defence counsel, Ms. Patricia Wynne, had assembled a compelling case that went far beyond simple self-defence. When her turn came to present evidence, she began with a photograph of Constable Edward Thornby in his uniform. This man, she told the jury, was murdered by Marcus Harrington in 1954. For 30 years, his widow lived with the shame of his supposed failure to solve a series of crimes that Harrington himself had committed. When she finally discovered the truth, she sought only to clear her late husband's name. The evidence was presented methodically. The stolen jewellery, recovered and catalogued, represented over £50,000 in current values. The detailed records Harrington had kept of his crimes, including his apparent documentation of murdering Constable Thornby, painted a picture of a cold, calculating criminal who had hidden behind respectability. When Lucy Thornby took the stand, her testimony was powerful in its simplicity. "He was going to hurt me," she stated clearly. "I'd crashed into his display case and he was coming at me with his fists raised. Gran didn't have a choice. The medical evidence proved crucial. Dr. Haydock testified that the bruises on Dorothy's wrist were consistent with being grabbed forcefully, and that the angle of Harrington's head injury suggested he had been striking downward when Dorothy defended herself and Lucy. The deceased was in an aggressive posture when struck, Dr. Haydock confirmed. The injury pattern suggests Mrs. Thornby was defending against an active attack, not initiating violence. Miss Marple's testimony focused on the discovered evidence of Constable Thornby's murder. She presented the chemical formula found in Harrington's workshop and explained how it could have been used to simulate a heart attack. The jury listened with rapt attention as she detailed how a dedicated police officer had been murdered for doing his job too well. When Dorothy herself finally took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. She spoke with quiet dignity about her husband's dedication to his duty, the years of shame and poverty that followed his death, and the moment she realized his killer had been living freely in their village all along. "For 30 years, I believed Edward had failed," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "Every Christmas, I remembered his frustration at not solving those burglaries. When I learned he'd actually solved them and been murdered for it, something broke inside me." The prosecutor's cross-examination was notably gentle. "Mrs. Thornby, why didn't you immediately call for help after striking Mr. Harrington?" Dorothy met his gaze directly. "I was frightened, Mr. Fortescue. We'd just discovered he was a murderer. I'd struck him and he was bleeding. I panicked. It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged man Miss Marple recognised as the owner of a local construction firm, stood to deliver their verdict. "We find the defendant, Dorothy Thornby, not guilty of murder. On the lesser charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant not guilty by reason of self-defence." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, quickly suppressed by the judge. Dorothy collapsed into Lucy's arms, sobbing with relief. Even the prosecutor seemed satisfied with the verdict, gathering his papers with what appeared to be a small smile. Judge Whitmore, known for his strict adherence to the law, delivered his closing remarks with unusual compassion. Mrs. Thornby, this court recognises the extraordinary circumstances of this case. While I cannot condone taking the law into one's own hands, I acknowledge that you were placed in an impossible situation. The death of Marcus Harrington, while tragic, came about through his own violent actions and criminal history. As Dorothy was formally discharged, Miss Marple noticed Inspector Slack standing at the back of the courtroom. His expression was professionally neutral, but he nodded slightly when he caught her eye, a gesture that suggested he too was satisfied with the outcome. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Among them were representatives from all the families whose stolen property had been recovered. Lady Weatherby, now in her 80s, approached Dorothy with tears in her eyes. "My dear," she said, taking Dorothy's hands, "your husband was a hero. We all owe him, and you, a debt we can never repay." One by one, the others came forward, offering thanks, support, and in several cases, tangible assistance. A fund was being established to ensure Dorothy could live comfortably in her remaining years, a small gesture of gratitude for the justice she had inadvertently delivered. Later, as Miss Marple walked with Dorothy and Lucy toward the train station, Dorothy spoke quietly. "I don't feel victorious, Miss Marple. A man is dead, even if he was a murderer." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "Justice rarely feels like victory, my dear. It's simply the setting right of things that were wrong, and that process is always painful for someone." As they waited for the train, Lucy showed Miss Marple a letter she had received that morning. The Historical Society had accepted her article about the Christmas burglaries and her grandfather's investigation. It would be published with full credit to Constable Edward Thornby's detective work. "Grandfather's name will be cleared officially," Lucy said with satisfaction. "The record will show he solved the crimes." Miss Marple smiled. "He would be proud of you both. You finished the work he started, and in doing so, you brought justice not just for him, but for all of Harrington's victims." Chapter 10. Snowfalls on the Truth Revealed. The memorial service for Constable Edward Thornby took place on a crisp February morning, exactly 30 years after his death. The ceremony was held in the village square, where a new plaque was being unveiled beside the war memorial, honouring not just his service, but his successful investigation of the Christmas burglaries that had plagued St. Mary Mead for 2 decades. Miss Marple stood among the assembled crowd, noting with satisfaction the turnout. It seemed the entire village had come to pay their respects, including many whose families had been victims of Harrington's crimes. The ceremony had been organised by the parish council with notable efficiency, and even Inspector Slack had come from his retirement to attend. Dorothy Thornby, dressed in her best black coat with a new violet scarf that Lucy had given her, stood at the front of the gathering with quiet dignity. The past weeks had aged her in some ways, but also seemed to have lifted a great weight from her shoulders. She held her head high as the vicar began the ceremony. "We gather today," Reverend Clement intoned, "to correct a historical injustice and honour a man who gave his life in service to this community." Constable Edward Thornby was not just a dedicated officer of the law, he was a detective of remarkable skill who solved one of the most complex criminal cases in our village's history. The plaque itself was elegant in its simplicity. It read, "In memory of Constable Edward Thornby, 1902 to 1954. He served with distinction and solved the Christmas burglaries of 1933 to 1953. Justice delayed is still justice served." As the covering was removed, a light snow began to fall, dusting the assembled crowd with delicate flakes that seemed to sparkle in the weak winter sun. Miss Marple thought it appropriately atmospheric, as though nature itself was acknowledging the moment. Lucy Thornby stepped forward to speak, her young voice clear and strong despite the emotion of the occasion. "My grandfather died believing he had failed this community. He was murdered because he had succeeded too well. Today we restore not just his reputation, but the truth itself. The stolen items have been returned to their rightful owners. The criminal has been exposed, and my grandfather's detective work has been vindicated." She paused, looking directly at the assembled crowd. But this isn't just about the past. It's about remembering that justice matters, that truth matters, and that sometimes it takes courage to stand up to those who would hide their crimes behind respectability and fear. After the official ceremony, the gathering moved to the church hall for tea and refreshments. Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Dr. Haydock, who had been instrumental in providing the medical evidence that had helped clear Dorothy. "Remarkable woman," Dr. Haydock observed, watching Dorothy accept condolences and congratulations with equal grace, to carry that burden for 30 years and then have the courage to act when the truth came to light. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect the real courage belonged to young Lucy. It takes a particular kind of determination to pursue a truth that everyone else has accepted as settled history." Mrs. Bantry joined them, carrying a plate of sandwiches that she offered around. "I still can't quite believe it all," she said. "Harrington always seemed so knowledgeable, so respectable. To think he was hiding all those stolen goods in plain sight." "The most successful criminals often do," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "They create a persona that places them above suspicion. Harrington built his entire life around his criminal enterprise, making his antique shop both the means of identifying victims and the method of hiding his crimes." Inspector Slack approached their group, looking somewhat uncomfortable in his civilian clothes. "Miss Marple," he said, with uncharacteristic humility, "I owe you an apology. When you first suggested examining those snow globes more carefully on Christmas morning, I dismissed your concerns. If I'd listened—" "Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "you followed the evidence where it led. That's all anyone can ask of a detective. The truth revealed itself in its own time, as it always does." Later, as the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple found Dorothy and Lucy standing together before the new memorial plaque. Snow had accumulated on its surface, but the inscription remained clearly visible beneath the white dusting. "He would have been so proud," Dorothy said softly, "not of the recognition, but of the fact that justice was finally done." Miss Marple considered the scene before her, the memorial, the two women who had risked everything to uncover the truth, the snow that fell like a benediction over the village square. It reminded her of the snow globes themselves, perfect little worlds that seemed peaceful and beautiful until shaken, revealing hidden truths in the swirling chaos that followed. "Mrs. Thornby," she said, joining them at the memorial, "your husband's notebook showed remarkable detective work. He had essentially solved the entire case. All that remained was finding the physical evidence." Dorothy smiled, the first genuine smile Miss Marple had seen from her since the whole affair began. Edward always said that the truth was like snow. It might cover things for a while, but eventually it melts and what's underneath is revealed. As they walked back toward the church hall, Lucy suddenly stopped and pointed upward. The snow had intensified, and the flakes were now falling thick and fast, transforming the village into something from one of Harrington's snow globes. A perfect winter scene that hid no secrets, contained no stolen treasures, just the simple beauty of a community that had finally acknowledged one of its heroes. Inspector Slack offered to drive Dorothy and Lucy home, and as they departed, he turned to Miss Marple with an expression of genuine curiosity. "How did you know? When you first saw those globes on Christmas Eve, what made you suspicious?" Miss Marple adjusted her hat against the falling snow before answering. "It was their weight, Inspector. Beautiful glass globes filled with water and tiny decorative elements should have a certain delicate quality. But Harrington's globes felt substantial, heavy with secrets. In my experience, when things are heavier than they should be, it's because they're carrying hidden burdens." As she walked home through the snow-transformed village, Miss Marple reflected on the case and its resolution. Justice had indeed been delayed by 30 years, but it had arrived with the inevitable certainty of winter snow. The stolen jewellery had been returned, a murderer had been exposed, and a good man's reputation had been restored. Through the windows of the houses she passed, she could see families enjoying their delayed Christmas celebrations, their trees still twinkling with lights, their own snow globes and decorations displayed without fear of theft or deception. The village had been cleansed of a poison it hadn't even known it carried, and like the snow that now covered everything in pristine white, it had been given a fresh start. At her own door, Miss Marple paused to look back at the village square where the new memorial stood. The snow had already covered the gathered footprints, leaving no trace of the morning's ceremony except for the plaque itself, which would stand as permanent testimony to the truth that had finally been revealed. "Thank you for listening to Velvet Clues," she could imagine Connor saying to his audience. "Sometimes the most beautiful things hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes it takes decades for justice to fall like winter snow. But truth, like snow itself, always reveals what lies beneath in the end."